I want to ask you specifically about this a piece of work. In the 70s, Gough Whitlam gave the go-ahead for the purchase of an expensive Jackson Pollock painting called Blue Poles. It was very divisive at the time, costing $1.3 million, but ultimately considered a kind of purchasing masterstroke, referred to now potentially Pollock's best work, also considered to be worth up to $100 million today. I think it sits in Canberra. Your piece here, I'm sorry to stand in front of it, but it's a bit squishy in here. It's called Blue Poles as well. I just want to ask you, why did you name your work Blue Poles?
So this work is growing out of a number of different stories. It grows from, obviously, Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles. So Jackson Pollock was a kind of an interesting character. He is kind of one of America's most important artists, establishing, I guess, that notion that some of you are probably might be aware of, is that idea of, you know, painting on the ground. So putting his canvases on the ground and flicking paint around and engaging body motions and gestures.
Are you a big fan of Jackson's work?
Not really. Oh, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it enough. But what I did think about or was interested in looking at was the fact that he's kind of lauded as this amazing person for inventing this style of putting canvases on the ground and dancing around them and making marks. But in fact, there's a number of accounts of him taking that story and taking that style from local Navajo sand paintings. And that's never talked about. You know, this idea that, you know, Indigenous cultures are constantly informing, you know, mainstream cultures, and the way mainstream identity is manufactured is often around, you know, Indigenous cultures. And I think that's something we should be really proud of. I'm not saying that's something we should be ashamed of. I think it's something that we should really celebrate.
Feel a sense of pressure continuing tradition of Indigenous art? I mean, it must have changed a lot in the last kind of 100 years from what would have been going on for quite a long time. When you're working on things now, do you feel a sense of responsibility for carrying the torch of Indigenous art into the future? Yeah,
so my family's actually is Gamilaroi and Wiradjuri, so from central New South Wales, so from Tamworth and Bathurst, and I grew up in Sydney. And I guess for me, it's interesting. When I take my work back to community, most people don't really think about it as art. It takes a little bit of while to sort of sink in what it is. But when I start talking about mark making and creating spaces, I think that sort of resonates. And I think that's what Indigenous artists are doing all the time. They're sort of telling stories, making marks, and looking at different ways of interpreting country, I guess.
And can you tell us about the materials? You often use everyday materials like tarpaulins, fluorescent lights you see behind us. Do you recycle these materials for your art on purpose? Why have you chosen these particular works, or do you not think about it?
I grew up in a family. I didn't grow up with any artists. I didn't even know you could be an artist. It was completely not really on the agenda. But I did grow up with an amazing granddad who was the Wiradjuri Gamilaroi fella, and he was a bit of a hoarder. And if you ever saw those hoarding documentary series, that was my granddad. He not only hoarded his own rubbish, he kind of hoarded everyone else's, which was kind of weird.
And there's always a blue tarpaulin once they get out of the house and the house is full and it goes into the garden.
Stuff was everywhere. And so the materials that I had around me were not oil paints. They were nothing, you know, none of those sorts of things. My pop just had a shed full of junk, which I loved. You could always tinker in there. I remember he had, I don't know where he got them. I think there was like a butcher shop down the road had shut down, and he somehow got out all the fluorescent tubes, and that was really the first time I started working with fluoro tubes. And they were the sort of the 4 foot ones, which were fantastic, and I really enjoyed the way that they made a line. And I guess for me, with all of the light works, they're really about the fact that you can actually see a line, you can actually see the mark they make, but they go well beyond that light bulb creates a body of light that's affecting us all, but it is in fact, you know, one simple line. And for me, that became a bit of a metaphor for mapping communities, because I guess in a strange way, this is meant to be a bunch of, like, some sort of community, and you can actually pick that I think there's 24 lights in every case. but you can't actually tell where the light begins and ends. So that they're operating as one. You know, they're collectively making a body of light, as we all are now. We're all sitting here as a community in a bunch, but we're all individuals. So how would you map this room full of people and try and map out how we are related to each other and how we engage with each other? In some ways, that's what these works are sort of coming to terms with.
I just want to ask you one last thing. How much has your upbringing, the community you grew up in, continued to affect your work? Is landscape, land still a big part of, you know, a driving force behind what you do?
Yeah, look, I'm really lucky. I get to work with my communities a lot there's a Wiradjuri Elders Council. I get to go out on country. Wiradjuri country is an enormous block. We're very big landowners. And so working with elders all through like Bathurst. At the moment, it's 200 years celebration of Bathurst. So Bathurst was the first inland town. And it was in Bathurst where martial law was declared. And so basically that meant every convict, every settler was given guns and ammunition and told just to go, and the government was just turning a blind eye. And so that happened where my family's from. So I'm working with community at the moment to look at that history, which is a fantastic, you know, opportunity to work with elders and to talk about those histories, which are really difficult and problematic. And in many ways, you know, working in these sort of forms, I guess, is a comfortable way to negotiate some of those really troublesome histories, which I think community actually really appreciate because they're complex. And, you know, community don't want to hit people over the head with a story, but they do want to educate and talk. And I mean, and there's also really funny things, like the community up at Bathurst are really enjoying the fact that once martial law was called off, all the Irish convicts that were given guns turned into bushrangers and started terrorising the British. So there's some really interesting moments in Australia's history which, you know, start turning those histories around and start rethinking things. And it's a good opportunity for us to, you know, kind of just read those histories and think about them and celebrate them.
Great hearing a bit about what makes you tick and what drives your work. We have to move on because we've got Thelma Plum about to play. Can we have a round of applause for Jonathan Jones? Thank you.